The wind didn't just blow through the slats of the shanty. It screamed. It was a jagged, predatory sound that carried the scent of frozen pine and the promise of a shallow grave. Inside, the air was a stagnant pool of ice, thick with the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of sickness. Sarah huddled on the dirt floor, her back against the rough-hewn logs that wept with frozen sap. She wrapped her arms around her 7-year-old daughter, Rose, trying to bridge the gap between their shivering bodies. Sarah's breath came in ragged, shallow puffs of white mist. Every inhale felt like swallowing shards of glass, a reminder of the pneumonia that had been nesting in her lungs for a fortnight. On the small, scarred table sat a brown glass vial. It contained the tincture the town doctor had sold her for the last of her silver, a bitter brew of bark and laudanum meant to keep the fever from boiling her brain. Beside it sat a single hardened crust of rye bread and a withered apple, the skin wrinkled like the face of an old man. Sarah looked at the medicine, then at the hollows beneath Rose's eyes. The child hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Her ribs were starting to show through her thin cotton chemise, a sight that burned Sarah worse than the cold. "Mama," Rose whispered, her voice paper thin, vibrating against Sarah's chest. "I'm so cold I can't feel my toes anymore. Is the sun ever coming back?" Sarah felt a tear freeze against her cheek before it could even fall. She reached out, her fingers trembling with a palsy brought on by exhaustion and hunger, and pushed the medicine vial into the dark shadows beneath the bed, hiding it behind a rusted tin bucket. She wouldn't take it. If she didn't take the medicine, she could sell the unopened bottle back to the apothecary in the morning, or trade it to a passing traveler for a slab of salt pork and a bag of oats. "Eat, Rose," Sarah said, her voice a gravelly ghost of its former self. She pushed the bread and the apple toward the girl. "But you need to get better, Mama. The medicine," the doctor said. "It was the only way the rattle would leave your chest. I already took it while you were sleeping." Sarah lied, the sin of the falsehood tasting like copper in her mouth. "I'm feeling stronger already. See, my hands aren't even shaking." She gripped her skirts tight to hide the tremors. "Eat, my heart. If you don't eat, you won't have the strength to see the spring flowers." She watched her daughter eat with a desperation that broke her heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Every crunch of the apple was a second bought against the reaper. As the night deepened, the fire in the hearth sputtered and died. Sarah had no more wood. She had already burned the legs of their only spare chair. She pulled the thin, moth-eaten wool blanket over them both, and prayed to a god she feared had turned his back on the territory. The morning brought a sky the color of a bruised plum. The blizzard had paused, leaving behind a world buried in 5 feet of suffocating white. Sarah tried to stand, but the world tilted violently. Her lungs felt heavy, as if filled with wet sand, and a hot, wet cough tore through her, leaving the taste of blood on her lips. She knew she had to get to town. If they stayed here, there would be 2 more frozen statues found by the spring thaw, a footnote in the ledger of a cruel frontier. "Put on your boots, Rose. Wrap your feet in the burlap sacks first," Sarah commanded, her voice cracking. They stepped out into the drifts. The cold was a physical blow, a weight that sought to crush the very air from their lungs. Sarah led the way, using her body as a plow to break the snow for her daughter. They hadn't gone a mile toward the settlement when the shadows began to close in on Sarah's vision. The Great Plains were a sea of white, indifferent and lethal. "Mama, wait! You're falling!" Rose cried. Sarah's legs had turned to lead. She collapsed into a drift, the cold blooming against her skin like a final dark mercy. She felt the snow embracing her, whispering that it was okay to sleep, that the pain would stop if she just let go. Through the haze of her fading consciousness, she heard it, a rhythmic thud, the heavy, deliberate beat of hoofs. The ground vibrated beneath her cheek. A shadow loomed over them, blotting out the pale, weak sun. It was a man on a horse, as black as a funeral shroud, a beast that breathed steam like a dragon. The rider was wrapped in a heavy buffalo skin coat that made him look like a vengeful mountain. This was Sam Thorne. Even in her delirium, Sarah knew the name. He was the king of the basin, a man who owned 10,000 head of cattle and a ranch that stretched further than a man could ride in a week. He was a widower who lived in a stone mansion on the ridge, a man rumored to have a heart carved from flint and eyes that could wither a crop. He lived in isolation, a titan of industry and grief. Sam looked down from his high perch. His face was a mask of weathered granite, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a Stetson, rimmed with frost. He saw the woman dying in the snow, her face the color of wood ash, and the weeping child clutching a threadbare shawl. "Please," Rose wailed, reaching up with a tiny blue-tinged hand. "Help my mama. She gave me her food. She gave me everything." Sam Thorne did not speak. His silence was terrifying. He dismounted, his boots crunching the crust of the snow with the weight of a giant. He looked at Sarah, pale, beautiful even in the grip of death, and clearly starving herself for the sake of the girl. Then, he did the unthinkable. In an age where a man's property was his soul, and a stranger was a liability, Sam Thorne didn't just offer a ride to the nearest doctor. He reached down, scooped Sarah's limp body into his massive arms, with an ease that spoke of terrifying strength, and tossed her unceremoniously over the pommel of his saddle. He then grabbed the girl, tucked her inside his buffalo coat against his own chest, to share his heat, and turned his horse away from the town. He wasn't taking them to the settlement, he was taking them to the ridge. To his home. Sarah awoke to the scent of cedar smoke and searing heat. She bolted upright, a scream dying in her throat as a fit of coughing racked her frame. She wasn't in her shack. She was in a bed larger than her entire kitchen, draped in furs and heavy quilts that smelled of lavender and old wood. A fire roared in a hearth made of river stone, throwing golden light across walls lined with leather-bound books and oil paintings of the rugged landscape. "Easy, woman. If you tear those stitches in your spirit, I can't help you," a deep voice rumbled. Sam Thorne sat in a high-backed chair by the fire, cleaning a rifle. The orange light caught the deep lines around his mouth and the scars on his hands. Rose was fast asleep on a rug by the fire, her face flushed pink, a bowl of half-eaten beef stew resting nearby. Why am I here?" Sarah managed to wheeze, her hand flying to her throat. "You were dying in my snow," Sam said, his voice like grinding stones. "Your shack is a tinderbox of rot. I sent my riders to burn it this afternoon. There was nothing worth saving but a bottle of medicine I found hidden under a bucket. Why hadn't you taken it?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. I needed to trade it. I was going to get her a winter coat, some flour, a bit of salt." Sam finally looked at her. His eyes weren't cold. She realized with a jolt. They were tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. "You'd trade your life for a sack of flour? I'm a mother," she said, her voice gaining a flicker of steel that surprised even her. "I'd trade my soul for her to have one more day of warmth." Sam set the rifle down. The clang of the metal was loud in the quiet room. "I've spent 10 years on this ridge watching people break. I've watched men kill for a water hole, and families turn on each other when the winter gets long. I've never seen a soul worth a damn until I saw you standing in that drift, trying to walk to town when you couldn't even stand. Why did you bring us here?" she whispered. "People say you don't want company. They say you hate the world. People say a lot of things when they're afraid of the dark." Sam grunted. He stood up, his presence filling the room, casting a shadow that reached the ceiling. He walked to a sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid, stirring in a spoonful of the medicine he'd recovered. He walked to the bed and held it to her lips. His hand was steady, but she saw a slight tremor in his fingers. "Drink. You're going to live, Sarah. I've decided." The weeks that followed were a study in tension and transformation. The blizzard didn't let up. It grew into a legendary monster, burying the first floor of the stone house. They were trapped together. The broken mother, the silent giant, and the curious child. Sarah found that Sam Thorne was a man of few words but deliberate, almost aggressive kindness. He was a man of unthinkable gestures. He didn't just provide food. He spent his mornings in the kitchen kneading dough with his massive hands because the cook was stuck in the bunkhouse. He didn't just provide shelter. He spent his evenings sitting on the floor with Rose, teaching her the names of the stars and how to track a wolf by the shape of its stride. Sarah watched him from her chair by the fire, her strength returning day by day. She saw the way he looked at her when he thought she was sleeping, not with lust, but with a bewildered sort of awe, as if she were a species of bird he had never seen before. One night the wind howled with such ferocity that the stone house groaned. Sarah joined him by the window. "You're a hard man to understand, Sam," she said softly. "You saved us, but you act like it was an insult to your character." He looked out at the white void. "I lost my wife and son to the scarlet fever 5 years ago. I watched them go and I couldn't do a damn thing. All my money, all this land, it didn't mean a thing. I built this place to be a fortress. I thought if I stayed high enough and lonely enough, nothing could ever hurt me again. I thought people were small, weak things that only took from the earth." He turned to her and the raw drama of his grief was visible in the set of his jaw. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "Then I saw you. You were the smallest, most fragile thing in the valley, and you were stronger than me. You were willing to vanish into the white just so that girl could eat an apple. You shamed me, Sarah. You shamed my loneliness." The suspense of their proximity, the months of shared silences, and the weight of their survival culminated in that look. It was the recognition of two survivors finding a harbor in a storm that had no end. "I can't pay you back," Sarah whispered, her heart racing. "I don't want payment," Sam replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I want a reason to keep the fire lit. I want to hear that girl laugh in these halls until she's grown. And I want you to stop looking at me like I'm a monster, and start looking at me like a man who's finally found his way home." When the spring thaw finally came, the valley was reborn in a riot of green and gold. The creeks ran high and angry with melted snow, and the air was sweet with the scent of wet earth and returning birds. The townspeople of the settlement gathered in the muddy street as the big rancher's wagon rolled in. They expected to see Sarah and her daughter dropped off at the boarding house, perhaps with a few coins for their trouble. They expected the unthinkable rancher to return to his mountain alone. Instead, they saw Sarah sitting on the bench next to Sam, her head held high, wearing a dress of fine wool and a cloak of velvet. Rose sat between them, holding a wooden doll Sam had carved for her during the long nights of February. They walked into the small white chapel. There was no long engagement, no fussy preparations. They had already survived the worst the world could throw at them. They didn't need the permission of the seasons or the gossip of the town. As the preacher spoke the words, Sarah looked up at Sam. She saw the man who had seen her at her lowest and decided she was worth saving. Not out of pity, but out of a desperate, grit-filled love that demanded nothing but her presence. Sam slid a band of raw gold onto her finger. It was heavy and solid, like the man himself. "To have and to hold," he murmured, his voice thick with the first real joy he had felt in half a decade. From this day forward, outside the prairie sun shone with a heat that finally reached the marrow of Sarah's bones. She leaned into him, no longer a victim of the winter, but the mistress of the ridge, bound to the man who had done the unthinkable. He had given a dying woman a reason to live, and she had given a dead man a soul. The winter was over. For the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't just surviving. She was home.
If you enjoy our Western stories, consider subscribing. It really helps us keep creating more for you.